very exciting to have everybody here. We did this first 3 years ago, and the original idea was that we just felt like in a lot of meetings we would just there was just a lot of information that wasn't kind of getting out to the entrepreneurial community, and so we said, why don't we kind of encapsulate all that information and do a program. And frankly, it just really kind of beat our expectations in terms of the excitement level, the great companies that came out of it, the number, I think we had over 1 million views on the videos, and so it was just great, and so we said, hey, why don't we do it again? And so that was sort of the origins of the program you're in now, and as Jeff said, like, we were amazed at kind of the number of applications, and so it's just really exciting to do, and we're hoping for another great session. And last time we got hit with COVID, and so we didn't get to do it all in person, so hopefully this time we'll have a lot of in-person interactions. And a lot of the value will come from the folks you meet, the other participants, and all the people in our network. So great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of the broad history of the internet, why this whole kind of crypto matters, blockchains matter. What's kind of the big picture in this? We're going to have a lot of follow-up, kind of much more detailed talks from our partners and friends over the next few weeks, so I'll skip some of the detail here and just kind of give you the big picture. So basically what I'm going to talk about is the way I kind of view the history of the internet. There's 3 eras, 3 kind of broad histories of eras of the internet. There was kind of the sort of prehistory, which is, the actual internet started in the late 60s, and there was sort of government and academic kind of use cases, but kind of really the modern internet began with the web in 1989. Then you had sort of the internet boom in the 90s. Obviously, today it's a sort of, throughout, it permeates all of our lives. It's the importance is indisputed, but for a long time during my career, that was actually quite controversial, and there were a lot of ups and downs along the way. But basically, I kind of view it, and I'll go into more detail, as breaking down to 3 kind of core eras, and I believe we're entering the 3rd era now. And then, and kind of the way I view it is, each era is marked by having a key network architecture, and I'll talk more about this, but networks are kind of in my mind, the killer app of the internet. And the architecture, there's a very interesting thing, which is the architecture of how you build those networks has all sorts of downstream consequences in terms of the economics and the user experience and other kinds of things. So there's kind of this nice symmetry where the way I view it is there's sort of 3 eras of the internet. Each one had its kind of dominant network type. Each one also had kind of its what I think of as its canonical computing primitive. So the web came along, and you had this idea. Imagine you had a product idea. I'm going to have everybody in the world put information on a big repository and share it, and it's not going to be total chaos, right? You need a simplifying principle, right? Like, how are you going to make this not a chaos? The web is sort of this massive multiplayer social game, right? And so, like, how are you going to make this thing not cacophonous? And the answer was a website. It was we take it for granted now. It's the oxygen we breathe. We assume this is just how things are. That was a very profound idea. There's some great videos that you can look at from the 60s of people kind of inventing these ideas. But the idea was you can take this information, whatever you want to do, code, data, anything else you want, you can put it in a thing called a website, and that website can link to other websites. And this was a very important kind of encapsulating mechanism, simplifying mechanism to take this really profound idea of, like, all of humanity is going to have information that links to each other and make it something that you could actually kind of work with, right, and give it a sort of a digestible unit. And then in the right era, so I call it read, write, own. Sort of the read era is we democratized in the first year of the internet, roughly 1990 to 2005, democratized information consumption. That was mostly what it was about. The killer app of that era was Google and Wikipedia and things like, well, Wikipedia's a little bit later, but like you Google something and you find it. That was a magical new experience. As someone said that the average user now has more information at his or her fingertips than the President of the United States did 30 years ago, right? Like, it's kind of remarkable. We obviously all take it for granted. That's really what the first era did. But having lived through that, I was a software developer back then. It was still very much what I call skeuomorphic. The web felt like you'd take magazines and you'd put them, sort of as websites, like brochures, and it was sort of a one-way interaction. There was some, like, you would submit a form or do something else, but it wasn't like really a social experience. And then in the, in the kind of 2000s, I was there. This is a really exciting time. One of my favorite times in my career was in the early 2000s, and we'd be sitting around rooms like this, literally like this is kind of like a bunch of people. And we were all excited, and we were like, what if you could suddenly? What if you could? There were little early inklings of it, but like, what if you could make the web really a genuinely two-way medium, right? Where it would democratize publishing the way that the first era democratized consumption, right? So there were sort of early precursors to it. A lot of it came out of blogging. Blogging was kind of this kind of interesting fringe movement where people would post stuff in simple ways, and you had software to do it. And that led to people like Mark Zuckerberg creating Facebook. A lot of the ideas for social networking and things were taken from those early kind of communities of bloggers and other kinds of things. In fact, you can kind of, I look at blogging as kind of this primordial soup where you had all this kind of genetic mutation and things come out. Like so you had Flickr, and that Flickr led to photo. There was sort of photo blogging, there was link blogging, there was a whole bunch, and each kind of genealogical tree led to like a whole set of interesting products. And so that was sort of the right era, and it was a wild success. It was incredible, right? Like like I think back to conversations we had kind of like this 20 years ago, and we were like, what if someday anyone could publish something, this and that, and like it's kind of amazing how well it worked. But there was, and I'll talk more about this. I think there was sort of this Faustian bargain where there was a downside to it, which is the thing that brought us there was a new network architecture called corporate networks. I think this is on the next slide. Yeah. So. Let me then step back for a second. One of the kind of amazing accidents of historical happenstances, I guess, is I said accident once, and Tim Berners-Lee said what accident, So anyway, I just a blog post, so I should be careful. It was a very great design decision early on, and it had to do with the history of the internet. It came out of academia and government. IP, the actual kind of base layer of the internet, was a DARPA project. Basically what was, at the time, you're in the 80s and you want to build this global multiplayer social game called the web. How do you architect it? There were no Google's, AWS, data centers, and this and that, so you had to build it in this peer-to-peer way, right? And so what they did is they came up with what we can now call protocols, which are just standards. I mean, you can go and look at the HTTP HTTP is the standard for the web, and SMTP is the standard for email. And a protocol is kind of like a language like English. Like it's like a set of things. Like if you want to send me something, here's the rules for doing it, right? And the idea was anyone could just, and then what would happen is the protocol would get built into software. Someone would build Open SendMail and Mosaic and all these other kinds of tools that would then take that and codify that protocol. And then you go download that software, and you'd join email, you'd join the web, right? But very importantly, there was no central intermediary, no one controlled it. There's standard bodies and things, but it's sort of like, we're all crypto here, it's like, people debating EIPs, essentially, like EIP, like it was sort of a community-led thing. There was no one really in charge, and very importantly, it didn't charge you any money. You could put a website, you had to buy a domain, $8. But you put it up, and if you built Amazon, literally, or Google, literally, you made $1 trillion, and it was yours, right? Or they didn't make it, but the company's worth that, So, the point was you built something and you own it, and it's not just the big companies. This was a very long tail of creative people, artists and game designers and anyone who wanted to. This is a very important idea. Anyone who wanted to could go up as long as it was legal, and you could build a website, and if it was valuable, you could keep the money. If you built your musician and artist or whatever, and you built an audience, you get to keep them. Same with email. This is a very, very important idea. And by the way, it didn't have to, people kind of look at it like it's inevitable. It's not. If you go read the history of it, there were a lot of smart people who thought that actually this information superhighway, if you go read the history, that was not the web. That was this corporate alternative to it, run by Comcast and Disney and other things. In fact, it's a quick anecdote. Bill Gates wrote a book called The Road Ahead. I think it was 1995, and it was just 2 years after the browser came out. So kind of, things had started. And he talks about all his predictions of the future, and he did not use the word the web in that book. In fact, later then bought all the copies and to get them off the market and put out a revised version. And so, it was not obvious in even 1995, 2 years into, this is 2 years after the Netscape IPO, so this is not. It was already happening, right? But it was there were two competing architectures. There was can companies own it, or is it going to be this crazy kind of, it was a pretty radical idea. Anyone can add something on, nobody owns it. And I would argue it led to all of these incredible innovations in the 90s, right? Because you had this sense of genuine ownership. You had sort of property rights. I won't go into the details, but a very important thing in that is DNS. So DNS is the naming system of the domain name system. So I own cdixon.org, and that maps to an IP address. And a very, very important idea in the first year of the web is that I control that mapping. It's a very simple thing, right? This is a very important point I think is lost a lot. This one simple decision, which is the user controls the mapping, that shifted all the power of the network to the user, right? Because what that means is I can build up my website. I just did this recently. I switched hosting provider for my website. And when I switch hosts, I don't like they charge me too much. They're slow, whatever, who cares? I have the power, I switched, right? I switched and I kept my network. I kept my inbound links, I kept my search results. Same with email, although that, email you could debate is now maybe getting kind of hijacked by Gmail, it's so powerful, but at least for 25 years, email was the same thing. You don't like it, you can leave. And what that did is it forced the providers, the Gmail providers, the browsers, all these people to play nice. They can't go and they can't do all these things when we get to corporate networks we'll talk about, where they play games and take the money and do all these other things. They can't, because you can switch. And it's not switch like fake switch, like Facebook has some feature where you can download a CSV file and it's fake because you don't take your audience with you. If you build up 1 million followers, I have a lot of followers on Twitter. I can download the follower list, but I can't take my audience with me. I don't want, I want to opt out. I want to use different software. No, you can't do it. Anyway, and that was a very, very important thing, and it sort of happened partly through, I think, the foresight of the designers, partly because you just had no other way to kind of architect it back then. You didn't have central intermediaries. Partly because it was government funded. There was a whole bunch of reasons, but it was a great thing, right? So then, let me come back to this. So then you had this rise of the kind of the right era networks in the 2000s, and this has, I guess, fast forward for a second. This has led to today, a few kind of quick stats. So going back, you had this Faustian bargain. So you have these new services, which I'll talk more about the architecture of them in a second. I call them corporate networks. They had a lot of advantages, things like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. They were better user experience. You could subsidize hosting costs. You could do all sorts of things. And there's a bunch of reasons why the sort of next year of the internet was dominated by these corporate networks. The downside, I think today, fast forward, and I think we're in a really problematic situation right now where all of these wonderful things I was talking about earlier on the internet are basically, you still have those networks, but they don't matter as nearly as much, right? If you go talk to, I don't know, a person down the street in LA who's an influencer, they're not trying to build a website or an email list for the most part. There's some backlash with Substack and things, but for the most part, it's TikTok, it's Facebook, it's Instagram, et cetera, right? And so this has led to the top 1% of websites. It's 95% of web traffic, I think 85% of mobile apps. The economics are similar. The NASDAQ 100, 50% of the NASDAQ 100 is the 5 big tech companies. That's doubled over the last decade. That will continue to double. Things like AI, I think, will accelerate those trends. So we're basically like, I don't know if you can debate whether it's a good or bad thing. I don't think it's a good thing, but we're basically headed to a world where 5 companies control the internet, and it's very, very different than that kind of original vision. So, what is the internet? Like the internet, we know what the internet is on a technical level, but I see the internet as a system for creating networks. So if you look at your phone and you think about the things you spend time on the internet, most of what you interact with are networks. Email's a network, the web's a network, TikTok's a network, Instagram's a network, Uber's a network, eBay's a network. Like most of the things you do on the internet are networks. And as I was describing before with things like DNS, the way you build the network ends up having all of these very important downstream consequences around the economics and governance and who can build. I don't know, I would say a quarter of our companies are rejected by Apple these days. Like, you want to get in the App Store, you got to get the permission. That didn't happen on the web, right? The web, as long as it was legal, you could do it. So who can build? There's very famously, this happened there was a whole period, you're probably all too young to remember this, but like a lot of my friends were building Twitter apps and Facebook apps, 2010-ish. That was like the thing to do. Why? Because that was sort of the new internet, and you'd build on top of the new internet. And all of those companies got wiped out because they changed the APIs, they changed the rules because they unilaterally control it. So network architecture is destiny. And as I was describing, protocol networks have this sort of decentralized thing where there's no one in charge. Corporate networks, there's this sort of trade-off that you had, which is on the one hand, they can do a lot of stuff, and I'll talk about that. There are good things about it. I don't want to disparage it too much. But But there's a big negative, which is essentially you're just saying this company behind it has complete power. They have complete power of the economics, they have complete power over the governance, who has access, all these other things. And specifically, so for example, there's a very important, and I'll talk more in detail about it in a bit, but there's a very important concept in networks called take rate, which is the percentage of the sort of the money. Think of it as like there's a river and there's money flowing through this river, and how much does the network operator take of that river? It's kind of shocking, but in social networks, it's basically, outside of YouTube, it's 100%, right? So they take 100%. So it's $150 billion a year of last year in social networking revenue. All of it went to the networks. I think you can make a very strong case that if it were architected as a protocol, if social networking if RSS specifically, which I'll talk more about, had won as an open protocol alternative to social networking, a huge part of that 150 billion would have gone to creators and users and software developers. Instead, it goes to these central intermediaries. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but that's the fact, is that the architecture is destiny, and if you build networks in this way that are corporate networks, you end up with the economics and governance that we have today. For me, the way, I won't go too much into blockchains themselves because I know we have sessions on that. I view blockchains as they're a new kind of virtual computer built on a network of computers. The key feature of blockchains is they invert, so in a traditional computing architecture, if if Google puts a server up and puts up a network, ultimately they control that network because they control the hardware, they can change the software, they do it all the time. Imagine, as a thought experiment, if Google said we're going to have Google Coin and we promise we'll only have 21 million Google Coins, no one would believe it, right? Because they would just change it. At some point, there'd be a different management team or something else, and the founders leave and things change, and if you give that power to one group, it's not really credible. Blockchains invert that. What blockchains do is they say, we're handing the power over to software, right? The software is in charge, right? If you write a smart contract on Ethereum, this is assuming consensus works, and I think the folks in this room understand that, but making certain assumptions, and of course, in the case of, let's say, Ethereum, these assumptions have held through the life of Ethereum, right? The code has, if you write code for Ethereum, you write something on chain, that is immutable code. And so, you can do a lot of things with immutable code. I think the most important thing you can do with it is you can build new networks. You can build networks on top of blockchains that give you the societal benefits of protocol networks, but a lot of the competitive advantages of corporate networks. I talked about a little bit about this, about protocol networks. I think the key thing to think about is that you kind of divide the features into two buckets. I think of it as economics and control. So economics, very importantly, protocol networks took no money, there was no take rate, all the money flowed to the edges. On the control, as long as it's legal, you can do it. That allows for all sorts of interesting innovation. They had a big weakness, which is how do you fund them, right? So email on the web, they funded through kind of government funding and everything else. There's a kind of a really interesting case study of, in the 2000s, there was a protocol, people probably know RSS, but RSS was like a legitimate competitor to Facebook and Twitter. I would say up until, I think it's like 2010 or 11, if you look at Google Trends, it dropped dramatically. And so the idea with RSS is, hey, all these great things we've done with the web and email and sort of all the advantages of protocols, this new thing, social networking, is coming. The internet's going to be more than just reading information. It's now going to be for publishing information. Let's build a protocol to do that, right? And so that was RSS. I was a big RSS user. It was sort of the default. Early Twitter and Tumblr and all these, Facebook even, they had RSS interoperability. That was just the assumption. You had to have that, and that was great. The problem with it is, Facebook is, all these companies, they raise many billions of dollars of venture capital. They could hire all these developers. Very importantly, they could subsidize. So let me give you an example. So YouTube came out in 2005, and I remember that. It was like broadband. Broadband was just, I think it had just hit like 40% or something like this of penetration, believe it or not, like everyone else still had dial-up. And so then entrepreneurs, being smart entrepreneurs that they are, light bulb went off, and they said, hey, a bunch of friends of mine and people I knew were saying, hey, now that you've got broadband, you can have high quality video. So let's go do video startups, right? So that was a big wave in like 2005-ish. And then just like all these kind of startup waves, you had different strategies. So like some people would go and try to license content, sports content and CBS content. YouTube actually YouTube started as a dating site, but then they pivoted, video dating site, but they pivoted and they said, let's take this view of kind of viral social videos. Anyone can upload anything, right? was very controversial. When Google bought them, it was very controversial because they were seen as just sort of piracy, and it's all the kind of the sort of stuff you hear like about crypto today. Like a lot of this stuff was much more. Wikipedia was banned on universities. It was a huge controversy, but it's crazy now. But anyway, so YouTube said let's let anyone do that. But the problem is YouTube had no traffic in the beginning, right? And so like, why would I go and post something on YouTube? And so they did. I call this strategy. I have a blog post about it. Come for the tool, stay for the network. And the idea is a strategy for kind of proliferating a network, which is you think of a network. There's sort of a single player mode and a multiplayer mode, like a video game. And so you sort of come up with like what's a single player use case until you have a big enough network. And so what YouTube said, here's the single player mode, which is you get free easy hosting. So I, Chris Dixon, have web traffic, but it's all on my website. I don't want to care about YouTube. They have no traffic in the beginning. But they gave me free hosting. So I went, uploaded the video, they hosted it, they put it in a nice little widget, and then I would embed it on my site. That's actually how YouTube started, right? But it was free hosting. Now RSS, what would I have to do at the time? I'd have to go buy a domain, which at the 2000s, people like me were still the dominant internet users, like people that had domains. That's not true today. Most people don't have domains. It's still kind of a technical, nerdy thing. You had to go buy a domain, but then you had to pay for hosting costs. It was expensive to like host video and everything else. So YouTube subsidized it, right? So that's a huge architectural advantage that I would argue that's probably the main architectural advantage corporate networks had over protocol networks, and why RSS lost to Facebook and Twitter and everything else is they could raise venture capital and fund it. And by the way, the other thing to mention is, if you go back, it's funny to think about, but early 2000s, eBay was probably the most respected, like Wall Street respected internet company, more than Google, in fact, the stock was higher than Amazon. Amazon was seen as kind of this really OpEx, heavy, they had to actually ship stuff. eBay was this beautiful, pure network. It was a pure network effect. They just put up a website, you had sellers, you had buyers, they didn't have to ship, they didn't have to handle payments, that was outsourced. They eventually bought PayPal, but and it was this beautiful network. So, and the Benchmark, there's a book about them, like that was probably one of the most famous, I think it was one of the best returning investments of the 90s. And so VCs in the 2000s, they understood networks, right, as being the biggest moneymaker, right? And so when YouTube and Twitter, you had tons and tons of money come into that space, and I think it just flooded over and ended up, if you look at the stats, like it just crushed, RSS and just all sort of, there were a bunch of other attempts to do kind of protocol network alternatives. And so that's why we had sort of this rise of corporate networks. So then what happens is, and this was very interesting for me, is, I'd say, for me at first, I would say, for me it didn't really, the light bulb didn't go off, like this is a problem until probably 2010-ish or something. Because at first it's like, okay, so what? So you've got they're subsidizing the hosting costs. They're still supporting RSS. They're still supporting all these APIs. This is a good thing, right? But then you had this moment. In fact, Twitter launched, I believe, 2006. They actually didn't have an app or a client until 2010, and they got it through an acquisition, Tweety, I think, or some other Twitter client. And then they actually deprecated. But there's a time around like 2011 and 12. If you go look at the news, like all of these services basically stopped supporting RSS. Deprecated all their APIs. There was very famously like Zynga and a bunch of other companies that were like cut off from Facebook's API. Twitter had this. I mean, there was literally a VC firm. I knew it. I knew the people there that was focused on funding Twitter apps. It was that big of a sector. I mean, it was a big sector of startups. It just like ended overnight. And at some point it was like, wait, what's going on? This is different. Like this is not like the web. The web's changing. This is for me the light bulb moment when I got into crypto. And I've thought about it a lot over the years, and this is kind of my analysis here, which is what happens is, you're early on, your Facebook, there's basically this cycle, and that over time the incentives, this has nothing to do, no one's malicious, no bad, I'm not impugning anyone's motives here. This is just like, to me, the logic of this network, which is these types of networks, this architecture, which is when you start off, you start off your YouTube, you're 5 people in a room, you're doing everything you can to get creators on, you're giving subsidies, you're doing all sorts, you're just like, because you have no network effect, right? But then eventually you scale up, you have a big network effect, and your incentives change. I mean, literally, like I've been in these boardrooms where it's like, hey, now you got to focus on making money. I mean, so there's like the literal kind of embodiment of that. But it's also like at that point, like interoperating isn't as useful. I'm the big guy. Like if you kind of look at, sort of this Metcalfe's law, which is this idea which is roughly accurate, which is this idea that networks kind of the value increases exponentially as the number of nodes in the network goes up. If you just think about that, like if you're a telecom company that has 95% market share in the country, and another telecom company has 5% of the 95% person doesn't really need to interoperate with the 5%. They can have a good business. Most people will use a service. 5% needs to, right? So there's just a core logic to kind of these corporate networks where the bigger you get, the less incentive you have to interoperate, to support kind of other networks, to allow creators on, and you get into, call it the attract-extract cycle. You start off trying to attract all of these different people around your network, and then at some point you start squeezing them, and you try to take the money out. And to me, this comes out of, again, it's not like the problem of, and people try to mitigate it. Google's famously "don't be evil." Like, hey, we promise we're not going to do it, but the reality is founders leave, and and eventually the sort of logic of the model takes over, and like the profit maximizing strategy of a company that owns a network is to eventually start extracting. If you don't do it, your competitors will do it, and you'll go out of business. So like that's just the way these markets work. So this is the challenge with them. And then I mentioned earlier the take rates. I think for me the two kind of people can debate. I mean, you see in the headlines, there's all sorts of controversy, deplatforming. There's politics. There's how do they rank the algorithms. Like I'm not going to get into that stuff. That's not my kind of main interest. My main interest is, I'd say, is twofold. The economics, they take 100% generally. It makes it really, really hard for the ecosystem to make money. And then the stifling innovation, competition. So, Epic is suing Apple as an example, maker of Fortnite. Like, if you tried to buy a Kindle, I always think it's funny when you try to buy a Kindle book on your iPhone, you have to go to their website. It's because they're getting around the payment thing. They charge 30% on payments. Like the normal fees on payments is like 2%. This is crazy. So anyways, that's corporate networks. So like I talked a little about this, like look, it's, the funny thing about being in the space we're in is like I sort of see the world as, there's people who agree with a lot of the stuff I've said, like Jack Dorsey and I don't know, a bunch of other kind of people who seem to think, okay, there is a problem with corporate networks. I think that's sort of decision point one. A bunch of friends of mine who are open source developers, like decision point one is, do you think there's a problem today? And then this decision point two is, what's the solution? And you'll see a lot of people try to go back to protocol networks. I would love it if we could do that. I've been trying to do it for, been involved in this stuff for 20-something years, and like, literally, if you go back, the only protocol networks that have ever gotten to scale were the web and email, and they were both sort of incubated in this hatchery fish environment before they had competition. It's been 30 years since you had a new protocol network that succeeded, and like RSS, I have a lot of friends that, like, you see, they'll try to build new things on RSS, like, I'd love for it to succeed, but like, let's just be real. Like, it's just not working, and let's go figure out what the problem is, diagnose it, and come up with a better network architecture. Okay. Here's just a slide around the take rates. These are the left side is the scale of these companies. The right side is the take rate. I'll come later on to blockchain network take rates. Zynga was a famous example where they stifled innovation. So the question is there a better way? So like, so for me, like I've been now involved in this space for over 10 years. For me, like I started to sort of sense that there were like real issues here. And when blockchains came along, it took me a while to kind of articulate it the way I am, but I think to me, the exciting part was that this was a new way that you could build networks that have the societal benefits of protocol networks and all the good things, sort of the best of both worlds. The societal benefits of protocol networks, but they can actually get funding and features to compete with corporate networks. I think folks here know this, and we'll talk more about blockchains later, but and this doesn't really come out on the slide, but essentially, a blockchain, you still have a core, right? You have a blockchain network. So let's take something like Uniswap as an example. There is core smart contract code running, right? But the idea is that core, couple things. One, it's immutable code, right? So like Uniswap's a good example where they can't even the community can't change that code, right? There's no upgrade mechanism, nothing. It's just that code is that code. If they release new versions, it's literally a new set of code. It's immutable code. It's instead of don't be evil, it's can't be evil. They can't change the rules. They can't screw you later on, that kind of attract-extract cycle. They just can't do it. It's in the code. And so you can decide as a developer, as a user, Or like take a social net. I think some folks here are building on Farcaster. Like you have a new social network built on a blockchain, right? The rules are going to be baked in there. They're in the smart contract, and you can decide if you're a developer, do you want to build on that? You can shop around, and you know what you're getting, right? That's very important. So you have competition, and you have people, you have choice. And so, what you should think of here is the core is much, much smaller than in a corporate network. You're building, the way I think about the analogy I like to think about with blockchain networks is it's much more like building a city than building like a theme park. A corporate network is like a theme park in the sense that the corporate owner, Facebook, every single feature of Facebook and Twitter is built by a Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, whatever, pick your network. It's built by an employee of that company at this point, essentially, right? Because they kind of killed off all the innovation around it. And so that's why they have, Google has 180,000 employees, Facebook has 50,000, whatever. Those people build all the features, right? And so if you're Twitter and you want to solve the spam problem, they've got to go figure out how to solve the spam problem. With email on the web, email spam was a huge issue, late 90s, early 2000s. What happened? What solved it? It's not solved, but it's a lot better. Market solved it. There were 100, early 2000s, there were 50 venture-backed anti-spam companies. Gmail uses Postini, which they acquired, the startup. So you use the markets to do it. So blockchains are very similar in that you have, the goal would be like a city, you would sort of like, if you're building a blockchain network here, you want to go build the core of the network, the mayor's, the town hall and the fire department, the police, sort of the basic rules and governance, really the minimum you can kind of build. And then you want to create incentives for people to build around it. And those incentives can be both they can't be evil incentives, like, hey, if you build this, you get to keep it. They can also be token incentives, and there's a whole bunch of mechanisms, very rich design space in blockchains to do all sorts of interesting kind of incentive design. And also, by the way, to accrue capital and fund developers and all these other things that RSS couldn't do, right? This is when I say it's sort of the best of both worlds, right? So you get this open ecosystem, these cities, these digital cities, this kind of substrate upon which you build the applications and networks of the future. And all these kinds of wonderful things around protocol networks, but you also get funding. And then features, this gets a little more technical here, but essentially, and I think I was just speaking to some folks who are doing Ethereum, new naming systems on top of ENS, ETHID, and I think there's a bunch of interesting ideas there. You can also solve a lot of the issues with that I was describing before with things like domain names and just sort of making it a modern user experience. I mean, ideally what we want, right? I think in 2023, if you don't have feature parity with corporate networks, you're probably not going to make it. People have very high bar. Users have very high bar. You need to have a very good experience. You can't charge $8 and go buy a domain name at GoDaddy, pay $8 and come back and visit me. It's not going to work. Okay? You got to have feature parity with corporate networks. You've got to have whatever it is, 5-screen login and all this other create account and all these other kinds of things, and having a logically centralized, organizationally decentralized blockchain core, right? So meaning logically centralized like ENS, there's one place that keeps that database, is one canonical state, but it's not controlled by one person or one organization, it's controlled by a community, right? That's a brand new thing that blockchains introduced, right? So you get the benefit, there's a huge, I could go on about this, but if you compare something like a Farcaster to Mastodon, what are called federated networks. Federated networks are kind of, I think of them as a subtype of protocol networks. They're still protocol networks. And the basic idea is, I will talk about this because it's important, I think. The basic idea with federated networks is you're sort of saying, this is Mastodon, you folks probably know about this, right? So is you're basically saying, I agree with you, Chris, that there's a problem with one person owning our global micro-messaging services and social networks and all these other things, right? Some people don't agree, so they agree with that. My solution for solving it is to take this one big giant dictatorship and chop it up into a lot of smaller dictatorships, right? That's what federated networks are. So each server is a little mini dictatorship. But the idea is if they get small enough that people can choose and play off the little mini dictatorships against each other and they keeps them in check, and that's the way to keep the power kind of decentralized, right? Look, I view that as an experiment we already ran. If Twitter, Tumblr, all these services in the 2000s, they were all marketed as RSS servers. And what happens is eventually one or a couple of the servers, either it doesn't work and no one uses the thing or whatever, or it does work and everyone congregates around a single server, especially in the federated architecture because you don't have canonical state. So you don't have a central place to keep a namespace and everything else. And so you have all of these funky cross-server, activity, I don't go into all the details, but it's just not going to work in an elegant way, and you're going to have this, you're essentially going to have a sharded system, and then you're going to have certain, if it works, certain servers get powerful, and we're just going to run the same thing we ran before, I believe. So I think you need a canonical central core to have a system with feature parity with modern corporate networks. I'm happy, I'll take this, questions if you guys want to dig into this more. This is something I've thought a lot about, but I can go down a long rabbit hole. So, Elena, you picked the best picture of Disney World. It kind of undermines we should have picked the worst one, but the idea here was, she picked such a good picture. The point of this is that cities are better than theme parks, although that looks like a good theme park. The idea, sort of the way I view it is it's a really beautiful thing if you think about the web and email, the fact that, particularly the web, the fact that you just had this one kind of simple idea, and then you have these, I think of it like a city, you have a city, you think about something like New York and great cities, right? They're very organic, they're very kind of bottoms up in the way they develop. And it's a very important feature is the interaction between the private ownership and public ownership, right? So if I own a pizza shop, I depend on the fact that there's free traffic. Anyone can walk on the sidewalk, right? So I depend on the roads and all the public services, right? And then I pay taxes back to the public services. And then in turn, what does the private sector do for the public sector? The private sector, in my view, adds creative entrepreneurship, right? It's just very hard for central bodies to think of people really want whatever, some type of yoga or pizza shop or whatever it might be, right? So in a well-designed city, you get this really nice diversity between kind of the public thing, the parks, the infrastructure, that give people this sort of feeling of an open, shared city, but also enable entrepreneurship. But then you also harness the power of free market creativity, right? And I think the web is the canonical example of that embodied in a network, right? There's a really kind of, you have for-profit things like Google and everything else, and then you have lots of interesting nonprofits. Wikipedia is an amazing thing. There's just a whole kind of wide range of it. And so you had this really nice kind of interplay and sort of bottoms-up organic thing that you kind of see in a great city, as opposed to a carefully managed, curated, kind of controlled kind of theme park-like thing. Okay, so let's jump in then to sort of why would one want to see a world where blockchain networks proliferate? Because that's the hope here, right? Is that all of you and other folks working on this will be at the forefront of a new era where this is the new network architecture that combines the best of the both worlds of the previous architectures. The first is community ownership, and this is similar to the kind of protocol networks where you have community ownership, in the sense of we're all part of the web and everything else, but it's not in a strict kind of economic sense. Here we add on, this is the read, write, own, kind of this ownership idea that you can actually own a piece of the network, which is a very powerful new primitive. And that's what a token is. I was talking earlier about how websites encapsulate, information consumption in this nice little bundle. To me, the token is kind of one of the key concepts of this era, where it encapsulates ownership, right? So a token can be anything. It can be something in the physical world. It can be something in the digital world. It can be code. It can be a game. It can be art. It can be whatever it might be. It could be fungible. It could be something money-like. A lot of the public impression of tokens is around the kind of money-like characteristics. That's a very kind of, I think, narrow view of what tokens can be. But to me, tokens, like a website, they're a way to take ownership and encapsulate it. But you can put anything in it. It's like a container. You can put anything into it. Including, in a well-designed blockchain network, you can put things like the ability to vote, the ability to own part of the network, to have a share of the economics. That's what I think something like Ether is, or like Uni, or something like that. The next major benefit is lower take rates. This is just empirically, we have a slide on this, but the take rates of all of the blockchain networks are vastly lower than corporate networks. Is this because they're all great people? No, it's because of they are all great people, but it's mostly great people or whatever. But the main thing is it's an architectural thing, right? You can't, if you charge too much, people will switch. The architecture is different, where the switching costs are much lower. You can fork a network. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you can't go and charge 90%. If you said, I'm going to build, a lending protocol and charge 90%, like, good luck. No one's going to use it, right? And so, it's the fact that it's open source. It's the fact that the switching costs are low. That I like to say the network effect accrues to the community and not to a single company. There's not one person who can sort of like go and do all this kind of stuff. The ability to fork, like all these things keep take rates lower, which means like it's sort of a zero-sum game. Like that money's going to flow somewhere. And so do you want it flowing to the network operator, or do you want it flowing to the participants in the network? I think it's better for everybody to have participants in the network. And by the way, this is not just like all altruistic. This is also a competitive advantage. You can go to creators, you can go to musicians, you can go to all these people and say, hey, would you like to keep 0% or 95%? This is one of the very powerful things that I think is going to propel this movement to success, is the fact that the economic proposition for all these participants is a much better economic proposition. Incentive to innovate. Whatever you build, you own. If you, the rules are baked into the code. Like we're not going to capriciously, whimsically change them and kill you off. And then funding parity with corporate networks. And so we have a slide on this, but essentially, the numbers you see around sort of blockchain networks and just the amount of funding is on par with those. The example I like to use is there's a bug called the Heartbleed bug a few years ago. It was a bug in SSL. SSL is the core encryption code standard for all encryption on the internet, and it came out in that process with this was a really dangerous bug that could have threatened all encryption on the internet. It was like half a developer was working on SSL. Like there was no funding. That kind of got fixed a little bit. You might say, well, hey, look at all these open source. Linux is well funded. It's complicated. Like Linux, if you look at it, the top contributor to Linux is Intel, and Intel has a very strategic reason to support Linux because their main competitor is Windows. When you sell a PC, if you buy a Windows, they make a lot more money on a Linux PC than Windows PC. So there's a whole kind of, you have to go analyze all the political alliances and things. Networks have not had natural corporate allies, and so you just did not have people funding things like RSS because all the corporate alternatives were like, I want to own that. I don't want to fund that network. And so networks need their own native form of funding to have any chance of success, and that's what blockchains provide. Okay, so let me talk a little about tokens. You see a lot of mainstream discussion of tokens as like magic money, magic beans. Warren Buffett calls it rat poison. They don't like tokens. I think a lot of them, when you read the analysis, I don't know what I think they're talking about Bitcoin or Dogecoin or something. I don't think they've actually dug into it. The tokens, I see tokens as in the tradition of video games. So video games pioneered virtual economy. So games like EVE Online, the dominant, League of Legends, Fortnite, like the dominant business model of video game. It's a very interesting side story. I won't go too long into it. But the video game industry, 30 years ago, made their money selling games for $50. Like today, basically, all the modern game companies give the game away for free and make money in a virtual economy. Okay, this is not theoretical. All these critics who talk about magic beans, this is a big part of the economy that they just apparently aren't aware of. So what you want to do in the right kind of blockchain, kind of network design is you want to design a virtual economy, and you have, in a very simple way, this comes from video games. They use these language, faucets and sinks. This is a metaphor. Imagine the tokens flowing like water in a house or something. And so you have places that tokens flow out of and things where they flow into, and those are sinks. And so, for example, staking rewards are one form of faucet, airdrops, other kinds of incentives. And then sinks are things like, on Ethereum, you pay an access fee, you pay gas fees, right? And it takes those and it burns those, and that's a sink, and it's something that eats up tokens. It's like a sink, it takes them in, right? And so what you want to do when you're designing a blockchain network is you want to do a couple things, but one is you want to balance the network, and I believe we're going to have a few sessions that go into much more detail here, so I'm just giving you the big picture. But you want to balance it so you don't have sort of too much supply or too much demand, and then the prices go crazy in one way or the other. So you want to get a good balance. With the faucets, you want to incentivize good behaviors, and this is very, very powerful. And this goes back to like, how can blockchain networks win, right? How can they fix the shortcomings of things like RSS? Incentives are a very important thing here. You can use incentives to fund developers. You can use incentives. Remember, I described the YouTube hosting example to fund like hosting. Come for the tool, stay for the network. Like blockchain's version of them are faucets. And then with syncs are very important for, like ideally a sync will align the sync with a useful application in the network. You want to align it with the network's utility, okay? So a good sync for, like Ethereum has a great sync, which is, Ethereum is a global shared supercomputer in the cloud that nobody owns and anyone can access. That's what Ethereum is. It's like old mainframe computers in that it's got limited resources, it's a shared resource. And so the way it solves that is it charges you to use the computer. And it charges you in Ether, and that's the sync of Ether. And what's great about that sync is the demand for Ether should go up as people build more applications for Ethereum and it becomes a more popular network, right? I think a lot of those fees, by the way, as an aside, will probably be paid for by the application developers and hidden from the users in the same way that I don't pay my AWS fees when I go to Gmail. I think it'll be similar to that, but like the point is like it's tied to the utility of the economy, right? So if somebody creates a game that's a hit game built on Ethereum, that will make demand for Ether go up, and so it's a really beautifully, nicely designed economy, right? It's not magic beans. This is just all economics. This is the same economics that economists have talked about for hundreds of years. For some reason, when it comes to the internet, they don't want to like do the analysis, but this is just economics, supply and demand. If you build a network that's popular and you tie the token of the network to the utility of the network, that creates fundamental sustainable demand. Not speculative demand, sustainable demand. There is speculation involved in token prices today, as there is speculation involved in every tech market, going back to the railroad boom of the 1830s, the dot-com boom of the 90s. Of course, there's speculation. If the point were speculation, that would not be a sustainable thing, wouldn't be interested in it. Like, the point is to create fundamental value, to create new networks that have the benefits of protocol networks, competitive advantage of corporate networks, and that create new virtual economies using tokens and incentives to gain adoption, to align behaviors, and do all these other kinds of nice things. I talked about take rates. These are actual take rates. Darren here did this analysis for us. So like Ethereum is an effective take rate if you go do the math on the gas, 0.06%. Just orders of magnitude different. You know, if anything, like OpenSea, there's pressure to go down on the take rates. So like, I think if anything, we're being conservative. Like, I think there will be downward pressure, is my guess, over time on a lot of these take rates because of the competitive nature of these markets. Because, so for example, with OpenSea, like they don't own the NFTs. They don't have lock-in. They can't force you to stay on there. Like, these are much more, the networks have to compete, right? Competition lowers prices. Take rates are prices of networks. It's the tax you pay. So, you know, if anything, I would think to go down. You know, we'll see. But, and then, you know, I mentioned this before with the kind of city analogy. You know, a very important idea in blockchains is composability. Composability is the idea that you can, this idea that software can be like Lego bricks, that you can build, one person can build a piece of software and somebody else can build on top of it. This is, you know, like going back to blockchain social networks. Personally, the thing I'm most excited about and seeing these proliferate is seeing the composability, I'll have like 20 different people will create different client front ends to Farcaster and these other kinds of, you know, Lens and et cetera. And there'll be a big diversity, there'll be all this innovation, people will create different ranking algorithms, people will create, you know, different analytics tools, people will create, also, you know, I'm sure all sorts of crazy stuff. To me, this is a really fun part of software, is that it's all of the creativity it unlocks, and that I'm just find myself personally like consistently surprised with how innovative and creative people are. And so I think, you know, creating these new systems on the blockchain networks where the network designer creates the core and then the ecosystem builds all these things around it is a very exciting thing. And by the way, you know, I talk about this with some of my tech friends who aren't in crypto, and they're like, oh, it sounds weird. I'm like, it's literally, if you go back in history of tech, like there's a long history of composability. Okay, so specifically the web and open source software, which are two of the most important, the internet and open source software, they were all built in this way. There was a famous essay I remember in the 90s, I've been into all this community, like I was into Linux in the 90s, and I had Linux machine. It was very niche then, and I remember it's hard to remember. It was a very radical idea in the 90s to have. So open source came from really the 80s. Richard Stallman, MIT. It was a radical political movement. It was not a tech movement, right? It was the idea that if you read Richard Stallman, it was that no one should own software. He was basically against property rights, period, and like digital property rights. So it was, and he's, had this whole kind of group of people, and they had the movement. They created GNU and all the kind of a lot of really important software. And Linux was, Linus's kind of fork of that ran on the x86 architecture. But this idea that like you'd have a community of people create an operating system and then people would use it, hobbyists would use it, but no serious people would use it, right? There's a very famous essay in the 90s called The Cathedral and the Bazaar by the software developer named Eric Raymond. And he basically said, look, there's sort of the cathedral, it's like the priesthood, and this is Microsoft, was the Google of that era, right? The big dominant company, or Apple or whatever. And that the cathedral, it had sort of, it was this centralized priesthood. The product managers would decide on the changes to the operating system, and it would all kind of flow downward. And the bazaar was this babbling bazaar of like chaos of people building open source software. That was, and by the way, fast forward today, I don't know what the exact stat is, but certainly the vast majority of operating systems in the world are Linux. Your Android phone is Linux. I'd say like something like half the software on your Apple phone is open source. All the data centers, all the IoT devices are all Linux. So it like won completely. And it just turned out that having a group of people hacking away on the internet was just a much better way to build software than having it done within the cathedral. Like the bazaar is a better way. The web is another example. Wikipedia is another example. I have a blog post about this. It was funny, like people, the revisionism drives me crazy because I was there. That's why I wrote a blog post. I went and cited all these people. It was so controversial, Wikipedia. It was like, it's going to destroy children's minds, it was literally banned from a lot of schools. It was this crazy thing, and it was just like, how could you allow, if you Google it, you'll see I wrote a blog. I quoted all of them because the revisionism drives me crazy. But it was a very, very controversial thing. Again, like, it turns out, just like having enough people kind of collaborate, you can create amazing things, right? And so I kind of think of it, I like to say composability software as compounding interest is a finance. There's this old phrase, compounding interest is the eighth wonder of the world or something. It's this amazing thing when you sort of layer on whatever it is, 6% a year, and you compound it. And I think it's the same thing in software. So the beautiful thing with software, right, is you write a piece of code, you put it on GitHub, and you write a math function, some Python math function, and that's it. It's, if it's assuming it's good code, like it's done. No one ever has to write that code again, right? And so you have this incredible thing where this global knowledge repository is sort of building up, and you're just getting kind of more and more powerful. And blockchains harness this power. Like we've just lost it with corporate networks. For me personally, it's probably the most depressing part of the kind of corporate network architecture. It's just like all of the innovation has been siphoned into these priesthoods, product managers, PowerPoints, like whatever they do. And I just think all of the kind of heart and soul of software has been sucked dry by them. I think that there's like it's a pendulum. It's been happening for 70 years. There's this pendulum that swings back and forth, and it's going to swing back. And I think once people really start to see how powerful composability is, once you have a choice, hey, I could have a social network where I can choose all this stuff. I think it's going to be a big kind of light bulb moment for a lot. You are all on the frontier, but I think there will be like a whole following wave of technologists who, when they see that and realize the power, reminded of the power of it, right? It's not a new idea. It's not my idea. This is a very old, powerful force in technology. It's just been kind of dormant as we live in this kind of dark era of corporate network dominance, my view. But funding parity, this is just to make the point, like you have, Nouns, DAO, Lido, like these are orders of magnitude more than RSS ever had. And this is money that can be used directly to fund development. So this is when I went back to saying blockchain networks have the societal benefits of protocol networks with the competitive advantages of corporate networks. The funding part's a very important part. Okay, I'll stop on the blockchain stuff. I'm going to give a little survey of like where we are now, and then I'm going to take questions. Okay, so I think this is Ali and our team did this slide, which is kind of just so what are you going to actually build? Like, talk about all this stuff. The very high level, just always in software, the way I think about it is you have applications and infrastructure, right? So infrastructure can be blockchains, it can be wallets, it can be et cetera. Basically, the simple distinction is infrastructure, your customers are developers. Applications, your customers are end users. We divide our team between that. This is how it plays out in every computing cycle. In mobile, it played out this way. On the web, it played out this way. In PCs, it played out this way. You had Apple creating the first, Steve Jobs and Wozniak creating the first PC. You had other people building the spreadsheet and the word processor. one of the funny things I observed in the history of this is that often the people, even people as genius as Steve Jobs, who of course is like the greatest innovator, maybe of the century or whatever, incredible, but even they don't predict all the things people will do with their devices. Steve Jobs was against having the App Store. He had to get convinced of it. And before that, the spreadsheet and the word processor and desktop publishing, this all came from third parties, random people. And so, so it's very important to have this kind of interplay, because then what happens is the applications make it more popular, right? The spreadsheet made the PC more popular. That means you sold more PCs, you sold more chips, you sold more hard drives. That then led to, the kind of Moore's Law phenomenon where you had everything got better and cheaper, you had investment in making it better. You think about your phone today that you hold, right? The phone itself is significantly better than the first iPhone in 2008. Battery, screen, everything. But the applications are also much better, right? And it's both. And the applications fed the phone. I remember a lot of friends of mine, they were like, I don't know if I want to know touchscreen, this and that. What finally tipped them, right, is the networks. You had to be on there because there was WhatsApp and Instagram, and you just couldn't get that stuff on the BlackBerry and other kinds of prior phones. And so there's an interplay, right? But then the apps being popular that were created by third parties, that gave Apple more money to invest to go make the phones better. And so you need both. So we think of it as sort of, you always need both. Here we have just kind of, loose categories for, for different categories of applications and infrastructure. Ideally, there's we're not at all sort of doctrinaire about this, dogmatic about it. We hope people will come up with stuff that doesn't fit into a category, and but this is just sort of loosely how we kind of think about the world. And then this comes from our team, Eddie and Darren. One thing a couple of years ago, we were kind of thinking about is it feels so chaotic, the crypto winters, the summers, but is there an underlying logic to it? And our theory was that there's sort of this thing that happens where you have prices go up and just sort of more excitement around the space, like you did in these various kind of periods. And that leads more people to say, hey, I'm going to go read the Ethereum white paper, or I'm going to go learn about it. And then they actually kind of get hooked on the real thing, on the stuff I'm talking about, like the technology and that kind of stuff. And some portion of them do, right? Some portion are speculators, but some portion get really hooked by the real thing and get involved and join. Maybe some of you, I don't know when all of you joined, but and then they join, they start a company, they contribute to open source code, and then a couple of years later, typically it takes for those sort of seeds to fully kind of bloom. And then you see kind of a new wave of excitement. So that was our theory, and we said, let's go see if that's true. And so we did this data analysis project, and we did. It was very interesting. Anyway, so we went and did this, and we think that it's hard to measure all the causality, with data like this, but we think there's a pretty clear kind of causal link. And what you see is this sort of steady growth. Now it is chaotic. It's not steady growth like you're used to if you're making accounting software, where every quarter you're growing consistently or something like this. So crypto is a very kind of chaotic thing. It reminds me a little bit of AI. I had an AI company. I started in 2008. I sold to eBay in 2011. AI went through, if you go read about it, they actually use the word AI winter and AI summer. It's a whole history of it. It was a long, long history. I mean, it looks like it's finally eternal summer now, I think, with AI. It's not going to be another winter. But for Alan Turing's paper in 1950, 73 years. There were summers, there were winters. So the bigger technologies have more chaotic kind of cycles like this, because it's a sentiment and funding and just there's all these other kind of factors that play into it, as opposed to kind of the more incremental software. It's just, if you're familiar with the S curve, it's like the technology adoption curve. It's kind of where are you playing on the S curve? Are you at the top of the S curve? The internet, SaaS software is more, it's very innovative. I'm not just saying anything negative, but it's at the top of the S curve. It's more about adding new features, taking this and applying it to a new vertical. We're all at the bottom of the S curve. Lastly, I'm a big fan of history. I think I've read every book that's out there on computing history, technology history. I try to. And I just love the story. I was once an entrepreneur, and I just love those stories of people in a room. And it's just an incredible thing to see just three people sitting around having a beer and talking about an idea. And I've seen this now, and I was an early investor in a lot of the things that became really big. And it's just such an amazingly kind of high impact thing you can do in the world to create software. and be part of these early movements. And it always, it's interesting because it's very easy when you read the history to think, well, it must have been obvious to do like a PC in the 80s and things like this. It sort of history rhymes and doesn't repeat. Like there's always a different set, like crypto has all of its critics and negative things and everything else, but PCs had their own, at the time it was like why, like the idea that like Bill Gates' big revolutionary idea was there'll be a computer in every home. That was literally the motto, and it was like, whoa, everyone will own part of a network. Whoa, like these kinds of things. Like there's always so anyway. So you kind of think back, and like for my favorite stories, I wrote I think actually the whole history of computing in the 1930s is super interesting with like logicians and everything else. The story of Fairchild Semiconductor, Robert Noyce, and folks like that, who then really created Silicon Valley and Intel. I encourage you to read about that. Obviously Jobs and Wozniak. And one thing I love about the PC story is it was the Homebrew Computer Club, which was literally like a hippie kind of thing. Like it wasn't, like it was literally like this. It was kind of like a hackathon type thing, where they were just like, let's go and build PCs for the home. Why would you want them? They didn't have applications. They didn't know why you'd use them, but that would be cool. The original Apple was today's dollars $5,000, and you could do like very little on it. So like. It was not obvious that was going to be like the big thing. Anyway, so I think about that a lot, and I think about, what's exciting to me, why I'm here, why I think you should be excited is I think these are very special kind of moments when you have new computing movements come. They're very high leverage moments. I think this is the most important computing moment. I think there's other important ones, AI, VR, et cetera, and there'll be a lot of different things. But to me, this, because of the things I discussed earlier, because this one really affects the kind of the future of the internet. Like we have to decide, do we want an internet that's like Disneyland or something like five companies own it? Or do we want an internet that's open and decentralized and innovative? I don't see any other plot. Maybe you could regulate it. I don't see a good regulatory scheme for doing that, to keeping it open. Maybe protocol networks will make a comeback. It's been 30 years. I don't, we'll see. To me, this is by far the most credible kind of way to, return the internet to its roots. And like, I think it's the reason you're here. I also think it's a great entrepreneurial opportunity, and you can really build big, important stuff. So that's it. So I think we have time for questions. Yeah.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for the chat. It seems like there's a fundamental conflict between startups trying to get traction and having it decentralized. Could you tell us a little bit more about how to negotiate that pathway of having that centralized driving force to build awareness and get users versus having a decentralized platform?
I think I would just say it's a very different, the way I would describe it is a very different go-to-market motion. So on the one hand, it's basically, it's the top-down versus bottom-up, okay? And I think it's harder if you look at it through the lens of the top-down. So what people are used to for the last 15 years with startups is you go raise money and you hire an army, okay? With what we're doing in crypto, it's a different motion, which is you're gonna go build the town hall, but then you're gonna ideally inspire a community, right? So it's a very different way to think about that. I think about, but they're very powerful tools. There's tokens, there's ownership, there's composability. So I think it was a very different kind of go-to-market motion. So that's the business lingo we use for there's two things you do at a startup. You build a product and you make it popular. Making it popular is go-to-market, okay? Go-to-market motion is the method by which you make it popular, right? There is actually a long and this is one of the things we try to do when we work with companies, is we've worked with a lot of companies that have done what I would call a bottoms-up developer go-to-market. And it's a different set of things you do. You focus on, obviously, great product, great code. This is a very discerning, smart audience. Hackathons, evangelizing, documentation, funding, grants, token incentives potentially, just a bunch of different things like this. So it's a different set of tools, but I think just as important. I think the two things you do at a startup are those two things, and startups should really invest in both. the number one mistake we see in crypto is sort of this build it, they will come mentality. That you can just go, and that happens occasionally. I think it probably kind of happened with Bitcoin, maybe to some extent with Ethereum. It generally doesn't happen. And so you need to go and evangelize and explain, and people just misunderstand what you're doing and all these other kinds of things. So I think I think of it as like strengths. It's just different, I guess I would say, not necessarily weaker.
Thank you.
And one other thing I would say is look, it's sort of pick your poison. Our firm does non-crypto, and I still I'm mostly crypto, but I do pay attention to the rest of the tech world. And if you look at a lot of companies that went public, for example, that were started in the last 15 years, non-crypto, regular kind of companies, the big challenge for a lot of them is customer acquisition costs. So e-commerce companies, an example, DTC brands, they spend all their money on Facebook. It's the take rates I was talking about before, right? Those companies are very good at extracting all the money out of the network. So they have advantage. That's their big kind of Achilles heel. And whereas look, Bitcoin, Ethereum, I think most crypto ads are banned on Facebook and everything. They're all word of mouth. Everything in crypto is word of mouth. And it's, think about all the blog posts and think pieces. And look, you have things like Dogecoin. I think Dogecoin is very interesting because for a long time, Dogecoin, I was like, this is, it's obviously it's a silly cryptocurrency. It's a meme coin. It's silly and it annoyed me because it's and then at one point I was like, maybe I should flip it around. Instead of annoying me, take a lesson. And now I kind of think of Dogecoin as this kind of clinical science experiment where if you took the dumbest possible coin, not the technical design, but just there's no point of it. There's no use cases. But it's a clinical experiment because you're saying you basically have all these people on the internet, in my view, who feel left out of ownership of networks. And so the thing that Dogecoin does do for them is it gives them a feeling of ownership. If you go read, I spend time reading. That's when I kind of had to switch. I'm going to go learn about this community and go read their stuff. And it was a sense of if you go read the 2 million Reddit subscribers in the Dogecoin subreddit, it's there's people that this is finally an internet service that I own a piece of, right? That was a very powerful thing. Now, I'm not bullish on Dogecoin and meme coins generally, but what if you take that evangelical inspirational power and combine it with a great product? That's a very powerful force. But it's a very different way to go to market than what people, they have. If you go hire a marketing person who ran a Web2 company, they'll have a different playbook, right?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, thank you.
Thank you.
Trying to get a better understanding of the regulatory environment and how to contextualize that. Could you maybe touch a little bit on some of the similarities and differences across Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3 with the regulatory environment?
Yeah.
And then what are the key things as entrepreneurs should we be thinking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'd say it's a couple of just macro points. First of all, regulation was very important in the first year of the web. There were some there was the, I forget what it's called, the Internet Commerce Act of '94. Commerce was illegal until that act on the web. That made it legal. That was very important. That was very forward-thinking. There was generally a view of what we describe as regulate the applications, not the protocols. And so the idea was you don't regulate SMTP and HTTP, you regulate the applications. If you're Gmail, you have to follow the rule. If you have a website, you have to follow the law, right? And that was very smart because the protocols are meant to be global. And they're meant to create a global interoperation standard. If you start regulating the protocols, it's going to kill the protocol because every jurisdiction has different rules, right? So you need these it was a very smart approach because you had this, the protocols could do what they're good at, which is they're the roads that connect everybody in a common standard. And then if you run a website, you got to follow whatever EU, US, whatever, pick your jurisdiction. And that was very forward thinking. There was a huge debate in the 90s over cryptography. If you go Google Clipper chip and all these, you'll see there was this huge battle. And there was a very credible story of, a very formidable side wanted to ban cryptography. I was just talking about at dinner with some of my colleagues last night. We used to have T-shirts that were illegal T-shirts because they printed some of the cryptographic code. And it was ban this shirt or whatever, because they were trying to ban math. And eventually they figured out, you can't ban math. Once the formula's out there, you're literally trying to ban ideas. But that was a serious debate. In fact, Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen, my partners, so people forget this, but their company Netscape actually invented SSL, invented JavaScript, like cookies. This all came from Netscape. And SSL in particular was extremely controversial. Because think about it, like I forgot what, I think it was like 94 or something. At the time, there's no internet commerce, right? And so like, what are you gonna do? They were literally like getting called in front of Congress or some government bodies or something, I forget exactly what. But, and they ask you, okay, so well, why do you have encryption in your browser? And they say, well, someday people are gonna buy things on the internet. Okay, what are they doing with it today? It's probably just criminals and terrorists, right? And you know what, maybe the critics in 1994, maybe that, like there weren't that many positive use cases, right? You had to believe in this future. And like, thankfully, that didn't get banned, but it came very close to it. And in fact, Netscape, the 128-bit version of Netscape, I think until late 90s was classified as munitions by the US government, same classification as cruise missiles. You could not download it outside the US. I remember when I was young downloading software, you're always getting these things like, are you in the US? You can't download this. It's like, so, you know, I think thankfully DMCA, there's a bunch of very, I think, good regulation in the end. My colleague Colin likes to say the US tries every form of bad regulation before they figure it out, you know, like, and so like there were all these sort of different things, but I think it actually was done very, very well. And look, that led to the internet, a lot of internet activity being in the US. It was very forward thinking. I think a lot of people, sometimes people in industry, I think don't give smart regulators enough credit because I think the good ones see this and find a good balancing act. And look, and you want regulation, like we spend most of our time, believe it or not, is not always popular in the crypto community, but like we spend most of our time trying to get more guidance and regulation because what happens when you don't have it is you have an incentive to act badly, right? This is why you have these FTXs and things. The incentive is to go offshore, to offer 100x derivatives, to do all these things because they spend all their time going after the good actors like the US-based companies that are following the rules and they ignore those actors. And so you create these very perverse incentives, right? So like it's a very active space, like we have spent a lot of time on it. We're trying to make the case that there's that there's a balance between innovation and, you know, we obviously want all these, it's bad for everybody, it's bad for the world, it's bad for the industry to have the FTXs and, you know, consumers hurt and all these other things. We think that, and we've published very detailed proposals here, we think there are ways to do that and to sort of navigate across, like, and it's a very hard, like there's, not only is there the US, there's other countries. Within the US, there's probably 5 major regulatory agencies that are involved, so it's, the actual specifics would be like talk to legal teams. I'm not going to give legal advice, but that's kind of the meta policy view.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. The second question is you mentioned about how gaming creates a virtual economy, and I recently have also heard a podcast related to like how copyright pushes the freemium games, and also like right now mobile games like half of the market share for the whole like gaming economy. I'm curious on your thoughts on the point of view of what's the Web3 gaming are at, and how it will impact the whole like Web3 economy.
So where's Web3 gaming at and how will it impact the economy? Yeah, good question. So I think there's, okay, this is a big topic. I think there's sort of, so I like to use this, so I guess for every one of these technologies, there's kind of a light version and a heavy duty version. And so the light version of Web3 gaming, which we've already seen some of and we're going to see more, we've funded probably 15 Web3 game companies, most of which haven't launched their products yet. So like you're going to see like in the next 12 months, some really high quality, these are teams out of very top game companies launch Web3 games. So to your question, look, games just take a long time. They can take, I mean, Grand Theft Auto, how long has it been? It's like the most anticipated game, like, what, 12 years or something? I mean, they just take, it's really, not that everything is that elaborate, but games take a long time. So it's going to take some time. But to me, there's sort of the lightweight versions of Web3 game, which is like a game that's like a normal game, but you have NFTs, you have virtual goods, you can take from one game to another, create secondary markets, you know, kind of like build an economy around, a more robust economy around the goods. But then to me, the really more sort of ambitious idea is kind of like the fully on-chain games where everything is, the whole back end is a shared composable service. And then this gets into this topic of like metaverse, which is kind of a buzzword, but I think a real thing, which is we're gonna just sort of, you look at the extrapolate from the trends, and like gaming is gonna continue to be more and more important in people's lives. Virtual reality is gonna eventually happen. People are gonna spend more time on the internet, more jobs on the internet, more virtual worlds, like all this sort of trends we've seen over the last 10 years, they'll continue, and that's sort of the metaverse, is like people just spending a ton of time meeting their spouses, doing their jobs, like it's this virtual world. And to me, there's a very important question, which is this metaverse, kind of Ready Player One style, owned by, what's the company? I don't know, whatever, Evil Corp. Is it owned by Evil Corp, or is it, is it a sort of shared, decentralized network, right? Like, to me, that's a very important question, which actually, this is probably the right time. If you just look at history, like the right time to really think about RSS and fix it would have been like 2006 or something, because then you had the iPhone. That was, what happens is that you have these catalysts, right? And the catalysts kind of entrench, like you'll have the horses are kind of racing, RSS and Facebook was a little bit ahead, and then the iPhone came out and boom, it just sort of like, and this is all backed up if you look at the stats, like, so you have these catalysts. So maybe there's a catalyst in the next 2 years, that maybe AI, maybe VR, who knows? Something may happen to catalyze and make this whole metaverse thing that sounds kind of futuristic actually be a real thing in 5 years. And I think that like right now it's time to think about the architecture for that. And I think games are kind of a wedge into that. Like, like the stuff, the Zero X Park stuff, for those who are into this stuff, like there's a bunch of, the Dark Forest, like there's a bunch of sort of really interesting ideas there. The idea that you have a shared backend, like what's cool about like something like a Dark Forest, right, is the backend is fully on chain, and then somebody else can create like a different front end, they can fork it, they can add stuff onto it. So it sort of takes, what's a very powerful force already in gaming, like modding and things, but it puts it on steroids. So I think it's a very exciting area. Look, also games just historically have always been a very good kind of beachhead category for new computing platforms. Early mobile, a lot of it was driven by, it's a way to just get a lot of people onboarded, used to it, using wallets. I think the most likely thing in the next couple of years that will get us to 100 million active crypto users is probably a game. So who's that? Someone building a game, but that's not like, to me that's part of it, right? Like the point of I like games, but the point of the iPhone was not games, right? The games helped drive it, and were kind of the wedge.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the talk, Brandon. I completely agree with your characterization of federated networks versus kind of truly decentralized social networks. I'm curious about your thoughts of the fundamental value that grounds the meaning of ownership in a decentralized social network, because it sounds like to compete with traditional corporate networks, you need to offer feature parity and also some sense of ownership that kind of offsets the network effects that the corporate networks already have. But what does that ownership mean? Because the corporate networks have done a pretty good job of creating the economic value in the existing networks.
Well, I think specifically with blockchain social networks, is that what we're talking about? So like, yeah. One way to think, so any network, there's generally, like most networks, the networks we're talking about are two-sided networks, meaning there's users and what I would call like creators and developers, right? The sort of the sellers and the buyers, if you will. They're not buyers, but like the people that consume people that create the videos on YouTube and people that watch the videos, right? And whenever you have a two-sided market, like the first go-to-market question will be, which side do you go after, right? Because like, and this is true of Uber. Like Uber decided the drivers were the hard part. Like there's always a hard side and an easier side. I would argue with crypto social networks, you want to go after the sell side. You want to go to the musician who's currently getting, whatever, pennies for thousands of streams. And so like essentially there's a whole economy of creators who are all about working around the 100% take rates. They don't use this word language because it's been so successfully obfuscated from them that they pay this because they just think of it as just like that's how social networks work. It doesn't have to be that way. That's like an accident of history. But so what do? They go and they sell merch. There's a huge industry around that. They go and they have a Shopify thing. They try to kind of get people over to it. They do offline stuff. They do pay. That's what Patreon and Substack exist. So essentially, Substack is a way to get around Twitter take rates. Patreon's a way to get on YouTube, right? You get them over to your Patreon. You get direct money, and you still pay, but it's 5% because it's on the web, and in web there's real competition, and so I think with social networks, like I think it'll be It's nuanced because you got to get both sides, and you can't like it's not like I'm just saying you go magically get these musicians and go to market. You got to cultivate both sides. But I think the really really strong value proposition is the economic side to the creators, who just like it's dramatically better economics, and that will play out at some point. Because if you're offered a system where you can have the same thing and get 100% or not 100% but 90%, 95%, whatever it is, or 0%, like is to me no question, right?
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
How do you think about defensibility in Web3 for protocols? Like, when Uniswap gets forked or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this all kind of boils down to also to the take rates, right? Like Uniswap, I think has remained, I think most people would agree, has remained quite successful despite the forks and things like this. If they charged 90% take rate, they would not have been successful. So part of it is like the defensibility is just simply much lower, and that plays in. That's why the take rates are lower. That's why a lot of the benefits flow to consumers and not to the companies. So that's just a fact of this space, and I think one of the reasons it's better for the world. But defensibility in the end comes down to pricing power, and pricing power in networks is take rates. So I think as a result, you'll expect much lower take rates. But I think the way I view it is, there's an old kind of venture capital meme, $0 billion market or something. Like there was this for a long time, people who are internet investors would talk about this. Like the goal is to kind of build things. Like think of Craigslist, where Craigslist is actually it's just owned by I think Craig and his friends or whatever. But it's this wildly profitable $100 million plus profit a year business, right? What they did is they took this giant market, the classified market, which was previously a much larger by revenue industry than it is today, and they basically deflated it. It's deflationary. A lot of technology is deflationary, right? You shrink the market, but they were also they just run a website. They don't have to run all the printing machines and everything else. And so I think with a lot of these decentralized networks, it'll probably be a similar thing, which is like you also don't fund, you have much lower take rates, but you also don't have to have a sushi chef and 50,000 employees and like all that. It's a decentralized network, right? Like it's just like real estate, like so the costs are much lower too. So it'll be kind of that Craigslist effect, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks for doing this. I'm Lucas from Cleargood, and my question is, which critiques of Web3 and its assumptions do you think are the most valid?
Well, I think there's saying it's early, or that it hasn't gone mainstream yet, rather. It's not early, but it hasn't, it's not at 1 billion, the internet's 5 billion users, and, probably, the stuff that we like to use is, 10, MetaMask is 10 million or something, so a fraction of the size. So that's legitimate. I mean, to me, my response would be, okay, that's what we do in venture capital, and, a lot of the markets are early, and that's why there's opportunity to be an entrepreneur. I flip that around and see that as an opportunity. What else? I think a lot of the other critiques I find just are literally straw man arguments. They're just talking about the rat poison, magic beans, tokens are all made up. Okay, it's virtual economies. It's very easy. I can explain it. It's not any kind of fancy economics. I think a lot of those people don't even, they haven't done the work to go understand the history of the internet, how networks work, network architecture. I think until you've just had that discussion and understood those things, it's very hard to critique blockchain networks if you don't understand the history of the internet and the other network architectures and how network architectures influence network economics. I find most of the conversations are just very hard to have because they haven't done that prior work. But I don't know. What do you think of the good critiques?
I mean, going back to saying it's early, you said earlier that we're at the beginning of the S-curve. So how do we figure out where we're? What would be the Web 2 analog of where we are?
Eddie and I here were talking about this at dinner last night. Eddie Lazarin is back there. I'm sure you'll meet. But I think kind of what you're saying is what's the inflection point?
Yeah.
And Eddie's view is it's just all going to come down to, and he may be right, block space cost. When you have L2s, 4844, all this other stuff, where you have sub penny. Kevin Kelly has this great blog post. He's the founder of Wired and kind of this blogger, thinker. It's you don't have innovation until you have waste. So like until you can take 1,000 photos and throw them away, you don't have Instagram. Until you have do 1,000 searches and throw them away, and like we don't have waste yet. Like you need to have like like Web3 gaming, the earlier question. It shouldn't be just 15 companies funded by A16Z. It should be 10 lines of code, a kid in wherever, India, Indiana, you name it, create some cool thing. It's so easy, it's so cheap. It's not like that. Today you've got to be like a pretty deep smart contract engineer. You got to learn all this stuff. You got to pay money. Like, you know, it's funny. Like one argument is it's just all about like AI. You know, AI. You go back and read stuff. I used to write about AI, and like you had this long history of people debating when will AI happen, everything else. If you look at it now, if you believe like this is it and it's really hitting, it really just came down to GPUs and neural networks and like how much scale you had on those things. Like all the other kind of complicated analysis was probably unnecessary. And had you just sort of gone and said, you know, look at Moore's law, look at NVIDIA's GPU density, how many nodes in a neural network, at what point will it start to approximate a human brain? Like and people did that, like, you know, Ray Kurzweil and others, but like that's kind of the thing that mattered. And I think it's probably similar here. Like, look, I mean, there's other things. I think the infrastructure, I think some people here are building wallets and other kinds of, the tooling is not there yet quite. There was a whole section in the 90s at Barnes & Noble of how to get on the internet. Literally, you would go, because you had to go and download there's all these crazy PPOE, I don't remember, it was like these crazy protocols in Windows, and like how do you download? So like the big innovation, literally, go read some good books on AOL, was send everyone a CD, because it was this chicken and egg. How are you going to download the protocol if you don't have the internet, right? So they sent them all CDs. That was a big breakthrough. Sounds ridiculous, but that was 1998, you know, so I mean, a couple of years into it.
Yeah, to quickly answer your question, I think some people would say that there is this waste in terms of like the noise, in terms of hacks, in terms of like the centralized.
Yeah, I meant waste in the sense of experimentation,
right?
As opposed to, yes, that's a different sense of waste.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the talk. I'm Nico from Skylab. So we're building mechanisms that allow developers and gamers to interact with. So we have been thinking a lot about incentive design. So what do you think of, like compared to, say, the corporate network, right? There's a center party that can make decisions of like how to incentivize the community based on first of all, their incentives, and also considering other people's incentives, right? But for Web3, incentives are more decentralized. So, and that opens to a lot of exploits. So what do you think of like how to balance that? And
yeah, so you're saying like particularly with like exploits, like.
Yeah. So for example, like when you, like non-style, they have to consider how to prevent people from exploiting the treasury. So things like that.
I see, like kind of like a selfish bribery attack and like.
Yeah, because everything's set.
Yeah, well, great question. So like, let's talk about, I didn't talk about governance yet. So the way I think about governance, so prior to blockchains, like what is the governance of protocol networks? The governance of protocol networks basically is, we're gonna create a spec, and you could deviate. Another way to think about governance is what happens if a bunch of nodes go evil. Okay, so like what happens if a bunch of SMTP, you have email protocol, what if some of the nodes decide, you know what, I'm going to start charging everybody to send an email, okay? With protocol networks, you basically protect against that because you have so many different nodes that if you do that, everyone's going to be like, well, I'm not going to use you, you're crap, right? Because you've got such decentralization that you've basically have checked the power of bad actors, right? Corporate networks, we kind of said, screw it, let's just have a dictatorship and hope they don't turn evil. Don't be evil. You can judge yourself whether that worked, but there's no governance. It's just like, it's literally corporate governance. It's the CEO, it's the board. To me, the big innovation with blockchain networks is it's now you can now write, it's not that we've solved governance. I don't think that's solved yet, and maybe it will never be. It's like humans don't solve governance. I don't know if they ever do. Maybe they just come to like an equilibrium point that is not awful or something, right? Like, but the big thing with blockchain networks is we can now encode governance into software, right? And software is, you know, as expressive as human thought. Software is the, you know, computational embodiment of human thought. And so it's sort of like we've now invented a constitution. You can now write down the rules for the first time instead of relying on the network topology in the case of protocol networks or the goodwill of a management team in the case of corporate networks. So we can now write it down, okay? And that's to me, that's the big innovation of blockchain governance, is we can now create kind of a formal constitution. I'm going to say it this way, so I want to be careful, like we're not to not oversell it. Like we haven't solved governance, but we can now at least start to have like a really mature, interesting debate around it. And in an ideal world, if like we've got a few people, but like governance, people that think about governance would get more interested in this area and start working on it. Like we have Andy Hall at Stanford who works with us, and there's like a few other kind of governance experts, and I think more and more are getting in there. Again, I don't think we're going to solve it, but I think we can come up with good equilibrium states that are that work well. But that's the big innovation to me in blockchain, right? Is that you can now put into software the governance system, and like what NounsDAO's doing, I think is super interesting, right? Like a lot of this stuff will have to come through experimentation, right? And they're running some really interesting experiments, specifically to bribery attacks or like selfish attacks. I think probably the number one mitigant against that is a diverse community. You simply don't have single actors with that. I think other mechanisms like slashing and other kinds of punitive mechanisms can be helpful. So I think there's a bunch of tools there, but and how do you balance that against all the other things? These are complicated questions. So
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Nikita from Chain Patrol. I had a question around, MMOs and, the economies that you talked about. Right now, even just managing like something like the economy in RuneScape is difficult. Like you tweak one spawn rate or something, and like all the markets change. Do you think any of these MMOs will open up their economy to like this more global crypto like economy, because now they have to deal with like external things maybe outside of their control?
Yeah. Well, if you ask me specifically, like, will existing games kind of add this? I think some will, but it won't be. Generally, the way these tech movements work is there's a new cohort. Like if you look at gaming, free-to-play gaming on mobile, what happened was that free-to-play started around 2010-ish when IAP started in the App Store. And the usual kind of thing where the incumbents, sort of like NFTs, they kind of dismissed it. And then there was a new set of startups, including Supercell, probably the most prominent success. And those new startups all became worth 10 billion, and sort of, it's a circle of life in startups, right? Big companies say this is, either there's usually some mixed. Some of them dismiss it, some do it, but do it half-heartedly. A few of them maybe going all in. That's typically what happens. But most of the opportunity is taken by startups. That's kind of the historical pattern, and that'd be my default assumption here. Some will do it. A few cutting edge ones will do it. Some won't. Like these companies, existing big companies, like unless you're founder led, it's just very hard for them to do kind of new things. There's a whole bunch. It's just long for those who've worked at big. It's very complicated. Even if the CEO is visionary and wants to do it, like they have a board, they have people on the team. I think in a lot of ways it's a blessing for us that this NFT it's the craziest thing in the world to me that letting people own something is controversial. Like it's better to have the company own it. Like it's upside down world. But the fact that it is probably an opportunity because you have these revolts and other things, and just like, okay, if you want big company wants to not do this, we'll just see startups do it. So I'd say, I don't know, we'll see. It'll be interesting to see.
Right. And how do you think, when you're designing a game economy, is there any like approaches you've seen or things you'd recommend when, to balance your economy when it's like connected to this wider system? It's not a closed economy.
Yeah, I mean, like this is, the Federal Reserve is a, giant organization of people that tune one parameter, right? So like it's unsolved problems. These are very hard problems. No one solved these things. And I think one would be you got to keep it flexible. Like governance systems, parameter tuning needs to be something, you're going to get it wrong. So it needs to be something you've kind of fine-tuned. Specifically to protocol design, like Eddie and other folks on our team, like that's what they do, and they have I think he's giving a whole talk on it, so I won't try to so take all the specific kind of stuff. I would say, kind of what I was saying before, like the key thing to me with faucets is, I guess, three things I would say. One is balance. Like what you don't want to do, I think people have made this mistake, where you get too much demand, you get a speculative run, and then you get a bunch of unhappy users, right? Like, so you want to balance supply and demand and have like a healthy, sustainable, growing economy. Same thing you want to do in a regular economy, right? Like you don't want to have stocks go too high or too low. You want to have just like stuff grow, hopefully. It never actually works that way, but like in an ideal world, everything would just grow 3%, GDP or whatever. And then you want faucets that incentivize constructive behavior, that they're actually helping to build the network, building software, doing good stuff. Not like the bad case is like all of the, some of the farming stuff that happens, and like you don't want just like bot farming and things. So how do you kind of figure that out? And then on the sinks, I think aligning it with like getting more true players to play the game. They spend money. I think like with gaming specifically, like probably, you need games that are fundamentally fun, and then people come for that, and then there's sort of an economic flywheel built on top of it. So you're also, I think of that as kind of buffering the economic side, the fact that you have this sort of fundamental economy, right? I mean, why is the Commodities Exchange, CBOE, in Chicago? Why is the New York Stock Exchange in New York? It's because the commodities is derivatives and futures and all these other things, because they came out of agriculture. So you had soybeans and you need to hedge it. And so you had this pairing of kind of the fundamental economy and the kind of the economic side of it. And so I think of the same thing in a game, is like you want to have this sort of core thing. People are maybe literally like, building their Stardew Valley farm or whatever, but then you layer on like an economy on top of it, right? So I think that's another kind of buffering thing. But it's a great question, and it's a deep topic, and I won't try to like cover it all now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hey, Chris. It's JP from Friends.
Yeah.
So I have a question around just like consumer products, and how in Web3 a lot of consumer products are built on desktop because there's no gatekeepers. You're not dealing with iOS, Android. You're talking earlier about gatekeeping around like Kindle, how you can't buy a Kindle book without going to the website. So recently, like Uniswap, they just created a wallet, right? And even they couldn't navigate this particular like App Store approval process. My question is like, if we're going to get products out to the devices that people actually use, like how do we navigate this? How do we navigate like mobile gatekeepers, platforms, and how does this environment have to evolve in order for crypto to be able to be like actually viable products for mobile users?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, like the workarounds include desktop, they include web, mobile, but it's an issue. Like, particularly the power of Apple and Google, right? I mean, this is the first time we've had a computing platform, like a device layer computing platform that was just a duopoly. And they are very aggressive on that, And I honestly don't have a great solution there, except for at some point you would expect there to be regulatory pressure due to the fact that it's clearly stifling competition, but that takes a while. So I wish I had a better answer there. Look, I think use cases, I think having hit games and other kinds of popular use cases that clearly are not speculative, that show true fundamental value, will help change the narrative around some of this stuff, and that will also help. So that's kind of on, hopefully some folks in here help with that by creating popular stuff.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Sweet, I got it. Hi, Chris. Brendan from Kiki. You talked a little about earlier from the adoption perspective, block space, wallet, really from the build side and the app layer. When it comes to end user adoption, so think consumer from a product perspective, let's say, what's the most important behavior to educate people on and to really feel comfortable with to engaging with companies that live within the blockchain space or are building in that layer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, I guess embedded in that question, like, I'm not sure software gets an opportunity to like, ultimately, when you're talking about the marginal billionth user, like, it's got to be probably a lot simpler than something that educates them. So, like, a lot of it has to be just baked into the software experience, and there has to be, like, I think there's a lot of things we can do to improve, but my suspicion is that, sort of what I was talking about earlier, like feature parity. Like, we just have to have feature parity. Like, it has to be as easy as onboarding. It has to be like totally modern experience. I don't think we're quite there yet. There's, things, these are all solvable problems, but things like key management, has to all be kind of just seamless and behind the scenes. I think a lot of people are doing good work there, and that just takes time, and it'll happen. And then I think ultimately, like, look, it'll be, I think a lot of this will be an economic proposition. Like, it's just a very low-hanging fruit how bad the economics are in corporate networks. So I think it'll, like, and take social networks, I think it'll be creator-led. Creators will say, I'm tired of paying 100%, and I want a different solution. We're already seeing that with things like Substack, people moving over there, and I think if we can provide the right solutions, people will move over to better social networks, and then the end user might just come because their favorite musician's there, right? Like, it's simple as that, right? Like, that to me is a more plausible path, for example, for a social network than, like, the end user is not going to care about decentralization, not going to care about all these kind of high-minded things, but decentralization plays into these things they do care a lot about, especially the supply side of, like, do you want to pay 100% of your money to this company? Like, it's just that's the thing that's really reassuring, especially on the social networking side. It's just really, really bad right now, the economics, for most of the network participants. And so, you know, if we were competing against this, like, you know, lean, mean, you know, thing that, like, they had 5% take rates, and, like, honestly, like, I think it's harder on payments. The payment take rates are 2%. Like, should 2% of the economy go to payments, moving some bits around? Probably not. But it's harder to go after a 2% target than a 100% target, a lot harder. Because, okay, it's 1% and they subsidize and they give you points and all these other things, and, like, you know, so I think that could be one of the sort of mistakes people have made in the history of crypto, sort of going after some industries that actually, you know, are much more resilient because of the lower take rates.
Awesome. All right, thank you.
I feel like once you see the world through the network economics lens, I don't know. Well, that's how I just view everything now. It's like, what are the economics of this? And, like, because in the end, like, that, I sort of believe a lot of the economics drives these behaviors. So. Great. Thank you all. That was fun.